The great journey that is Lent presents us with an assortment of possibilities. As we all know, Lent is a time of preparation, purification even. A time to step back and reflect and think about the great mysteries of salvation, of life, of death, the resurrection of Jesus. It is during these 40 days of Lent that we are asked to look at what we believe and to give praise and thanks to the God who not only has already saved us, but continues to offer us salvation. And if you pay attention closely during these days of Lent, you will discover over and over again one of the great themes of our church, the idea of covenant. And I know this is something I've mentioned often, but the idea of covenant comes up over and over again because it was the primary way in which the people of Israel understood their relationship with God. That's what made them the chosen people. Not only because God chose them, but more importantly that God entered into covenant with them. And not just a covenant, but several covenants that kept getting renewed down through the ages. And the covenant, as you all know, is an agreement, something that is binding, something that is formal, something that is solemn. And it's not simply a contract, nor is it something that we enter into lightly, although it is a word that tends to be used very casually these days. Now, a covenant obliges both parties. It's never one-sided. And the closest thing we have to that understanding in our modern church today is that of marriage. We teach that a couple enters into a covenant unconditionally, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, and that it happens indissolubly, till death do us part. There are obligations. I promise to love you and to cherish you all the days of my life. So the relationship between God and Israel is best understood in this way. The Lord and the people enter into not just one, but several covenants that continue to bind them together. And at its most basic, the covenant bound the people to love and serve the Lord and the Lord alone. But more importantly, it also bound God. And that's what many of us forget. Because of the covenant, God has obligations. God is bound to love and protect and to care for the people of Israel. And even though the people repeatedly broke the covenant, God never failed to love them. Even when they turned away from God, God always invited them back. And that, in 2 sentences, is the Old Testament. Think back to the story of Noah and the flood. I am now establishing my covenant, God says, with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, all the birds and the various tame and wild animals that were with you and came out of the ark. I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all bodily creatures be destroyed by the waters of a flood. It's not a covenant limited to humans, but a covenant with every living creature, a covenant with all of creation, God's covenant with God's creation, which is what the Pope keeps reminding us of, our obligation to care for the earth and to care for all of creation because of the covenant between God and every living creature. Today we heard about another covenant. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and all the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you. The covenant with Abraham, this covenant, is the primary basis of God's relationship with Israel, the primary reason that they are the chosen people. And once again, it is a covenant that obliges God. I will bless you abundantly. I will make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands on the seashore. And in biblical times, that was about as generous a blessing as one could give. In a society that was based on agriculture, Those who belonged to big families were blessed because there were many more hands to work the fields and to tend to the flocks. And then God made another covenant, probably the most famous one, the covenant with Moses and the people on Sinai. Most of us call it the Ten Commandments. But the commandments only present the people's side of the covenant. The Ten Commandments are the people's obligations. When we often think of the Ten Commandments, that's all we think of. But we have to remember that God undertakes obligations. God promises the people, you will be my people, and I will be your God, which obligates God to recognize all the other covenants that have been made with Noah, with Abraham, to confirm the promise to care for and to love the people. That's God's obligation. And finally, another covenant is made with David. I took you from the pasture, God said through Nathan, from following the flock to become ruler over my people Israel. I was with you wherever you went, and I will make your name like that of the greatest on earth. I will raise up your offspring after you, sprung from your loins, and I will establish his kingdom. Your house and your kingdom are firm forever before me. Your throne shall be firmly established forever. The Lord promises that the Messiah will come from David's line, and so it comes to pass. And it comes to a head in the person of Jesus with what we call the New Covenant. We use the term at Mass all the time. Theologians always refer to Jesus coming as the New Covenant because it is no longer limited, but has been extended to the whole of humanity. And it is a covenant that involves God's very self. God incarnated, meaning God becomes one of us. God suffered and died, experiencing the most human of fears and emotions. But God was ultimately raised from the dead, which means that the love of God is always victorious. Always. And the new covenant that God as human and God as God enter into, which is why we are saved, which is why salvation is always possible, which is why God has already saved us. And God confirms that in today's gospel. The disciples hear a voice that says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." We have a God who loves us so much to the point that God binds himself in an agreement that cannot be broken. He cannot break, and always holds fast to that agreement. And even when we turn away, even when we forget our relationship with God, even when we reject God and stray or are angry with God, God's response is always going to be, "You will be my people, and I will be your God." That's the reassurance God has been giving us for generations. That God always loves us, that God's love is always victorious, that God always loves us, and at its best, that's what Lent reminds us of. A God who is bound to us, a God who continually calls us back, a God who loves us in a way that we cannot even begin to imagine.